A fateful marriage. Maximilian and Mary, son of the German emperor and daughter of the Duke of Burgundy, married in 1477. It was by far the most fateful marriage of their day, affecting the history of Europe for centuries to come, bringing war after war down to 1917. For a time it looked as though the wedding might not take place. The nobles, who had not wanted the young Habsburg of Austria to marry their duchess, did everything they could to prevent it. Charles the Bold, Mary's father, who had arranged the wedding, died suddenly. The States General had the royal palace in Ghent immediately surrounded by guards, making Mary a prisoner, and separating her from her stepmother, the Duchess Margaret. Meanwhile, they sent a delegation to France to confer with Louis XI and to arrange for the marriage of Mary to the king's son, although the Dauphin Charles was only 8 years old and the Duchess was 20. Mary was frightened to tears, but managed to smuggle out a letter to Maximilian, to whom she had long been betrothed, and who, from all she had heard, was such a brave knight that he would surely come to her rescue. The Duchess Margaret also sent him an appeal for help. Nothing could suit Maximilian better than this, to be the brave knight rescuing the fair maiden, especially when he found the maiden so sweet, so utterly lovable as Mary. That was a most happy day when Maximilian appeared to claim his bride. The perfect knight of a maiden's dream, he came clad in armor of shining silver, with a wreath of precious jewels encircling his blonde hair. The French-speaking bride could not reply to his German greeting, but as it was never any trouble for the charming Max to pick up another language, he was soon expressing his love for her in French, and they found they had many things in common. Hunting, for example, was Maximilian's favorite sport. Mary, too, loved the chase and had a beautiful, well-trained falcon, also a pet greyhound that always slept by her bed and soon included Maximilian in his affection. "If we but had peace," said the happy young husband, "we would be living in a garden of roses." Peaceful life in a garden, had it been possible, would hardly have been a life for that restless, romantic knight, with his love of adventure and excitement. Maximilian was soon in his silver armor again, speeding off to war. Upon the death of Charles the Bold, Louis XI had been quick to reclaim the original French province of Burgundy, delighted at last to get that long independent part of France under the rule of the crown. Maximilian made it his business to try to recover it, and resumed his father-in-law's endless war against the French king. This only resulted in further antagonizing the States General. Not only had the nobles no interest in Burgundy, but they were sick of raising money for war. Maximilian was away on the field of battle when both of his children were born, first a son and then a daughter, who were eventually to marry a son and daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. The boy, born in 1478, was named for Mary's grandfather, Philip the Good. The baby sister, 2 years younger, was named for Duchess Margaret, who, though only 33, was now a grandmother, and to be called the Grand Lady, or Madame la Grande. In 1482, when the children were 2 and 4, their father, to Mary's joy, was home again. One day, when the weather was mild, the young couple went hunting with their ladies and nobles. Jumping a ditch, Mary's horse stumbled and fell upon her. She died a few days later, leaving Maximilian and Madame la Grande, who had both loved her so dearly, stricken with grief. According to Mary's will, Maximilian was to act as ruler of the Netherlands until her heir, 4-year-old Duke Philip, was old enough to rule. To have had to accept the Habsburg as Mary's husband had been distasteful enough to the States General and the people of Netherlands. To have to accept him as their ruler was so intolerable that they proceeded to block him in every possible way. First, by cutting off the money, they put a stop to Maximilian's war against France. Then, in spite of his objections, they sent a delegation to make peace with Louis XI and to seal the treaty with the marriage of 2-year-old Margaret with the Dauphin Charles, to whom they had first wanted to marry her mother. They offered as her dowry the provinces of Artois and Franche-Comté, to the delight of the old king, and promised him, as soon as spring came and the roads were passable, to send the little girl to France to be given an education suitable for a future queen. Margaret of Austria, Queen of France. Little Margaret Habsburg was 3 years old when she left home in April 1483 to marry the son of her father's greatest enemy. Her young grandmother was in tears. The little girl rode away on the lap of her nurse, seated in a golden couch hung between 2 broad-backed Flemish horses. An elegant escort of ladies and nobles were going with her to the border. There, Madame Anne of France, the king's oldest daughter, with her husband, the Duke of Beaujeu, and a large French escort, were to meet their future queen, take her to Paris, and from there to her new home, the castle of Amboise. On this April day, the little Duchess of Austria was starting out on a most amazing life, to be checkered with alternating fortune and misfortune. First, she would be Queen of France. Next, the Infanta of Spain, married to Isabella's son. Then, the Duchess of Savoy. And lastly, the Regent of the Netherlands, where she would see her young nephew, the King of Spain, become the next German emperor. As the horses started, the little traveler leaned out as long as she could see, waving kisses to her dear Madame Legrand. Louis XI, the old Spider King, was now nearing the end of his life, though he clung to it with every ounce of strength he had left, and he still carried on the government of France. What kind of king his 12-year-old son would eventually make was a disturbing question, but he was doing the best he could to pass on to Charles what he had learned of the tricky business of ruling a kingdom, especially the wastefulness of war. The king closed a book from which he had been reading aloud to Charles one afternoon, and while the boy repeated what he had read, studied him through half-closed lids, his old eyes still as bright as bits of steel. They were an odd pair, the wizened old man wrapped in a dark fur-lined cloak, and the boy in red satin, with a head so large for his small frame and spindly legs that he looked more like a gnome. They were in the castle of Amboise, where Charles lived with his tutor, strictly guarded for his safety. The old king had made the 10-mile trip from his residence at Tours to bring this beautiful book of maxims he had made especially for his son. Intended to teach Charles the value of peace, he had called it the Rosebush of War, because, as he pointed out in the preface, the counsel of wise men refreshed the spirit like a fragrance. When you come to reign over this noble kingdom, you must smell one rose from this rosebush every day. Whatever slight comfort the old king could derive from the prospect of having to leave France to this young Charles was that his oldest daughter Anne would act as regent for her young brother until he came of age. Anne of France was 23 and so intelligent that her father called her the least foolish woman in France, which for him was the highest praise. As the shadow of death crept closer, Louis XI grew desperate to postpone the final day, and sent about here and there for some sacred relic or other mystical help. He got permission from the Pope to have the vial of sacred oil with which he had been anointed king brought from Rheims and placed on a chest where he could see it from his bed. From Lorenzo de' Medici he heard of an Italian monk noted for his holiness, and prevailed upon the holy hermit to come to Tours and to offer prayers in his behalf. Up to the very end, the thoughts of the old king were centered, as they always had been, upon the welfare of France. In almost his last hour, he called for the Duke of Beaujeu, Anne's husband, and urged him to avoid war. He had made his last confession and was lying quite still. Suddenly he opened his eyes and called for his son-in-law, who hastened in and bent over the bed. "Keep the peace," said Louis. "For 5 or 6 years at least there must be peace in order for France to grow strong." Satisfied then, the old king closed his eyes and drifted away, listening to the voice of the holy monk chanting the last prayer. "Go forth, Christian soul, out of this world, in the name of God, the Father Almighty, who created thee." And so Louis XI went at dawn on August 31st, 1483, leaving his beloved kingdom to his 12-year-old son, who became Charles VIII. Margaret, Queen of France, now 5 years old, was playing with her parrot, whom she called her green sweetheart, and whose cage stood in one of the deep-set windows of the castle of Amboise. She was trying to make him say her name, but he merely winked at her in silence, moving deliberately back and forth on his perch, in and out of the sun, which turned the little child's hair into a shower of gold. The little queen, as usual, was wearing black. Her governess, who sat nearby hemming a doll's dress to match, thought black most becoming to the little girl's fair skin. Margaret went to sit beside her and hold the new doll which had just come from Paris, and look again at her beautiful new belt. Her governess had made it for her out of one of the heavy gold chains she had brought with her from Flanders. That seemed a very long time ago, the day that Madame Anne, Charles' grown-up sister, had come to meet her at the border in that beautiful violet dress. Then His Majesty, the old king, was still alive, and Madame Anne was not as busy as she was now. Now she had to govern France until Charles was old enough. Charles would soon reach 15, though he was not very big, not nearly so tall as some of the pages at his court. Once in a while his tutor brought him over to pay Margaret a visit. In his part of the castle, Charles had a household like his young queen's. The Grand Master of her court was her governess's husband. There were 20 ladies in waiting, 6 lords, a doctor, a priest, a secretary, lots of servants, such as laundresses and cooks. The only one who came from Flanders was her nurse. Margaret remembered sitting on her nurse's lap and waving to her grandmother, who was crying because she, Margaret, was going away. And maybe, too, because Madame's brother, Edward, King of England, had died, and she would never see him again. Louise said that the kings of England and their families always hated the kings of France, and probably her grandmother did not want her to marry Charles and become a French queen. That was Louise of Savoy, who was 9. Louise lived with Madame Anne and the Duke of Beaujeu, who was her uncle, because her mother had died, and her father was very poor, even though his father was the Duke of Savoy. Louise knew everything, all about which people liked or hated each other, and why, and what might happen to them. Louise said that if Charles should die, as sickly boys often did, the next person to be king would be Louis of Orleans, who was over 20 years old and big and strong. But if Louis of Orleans should die of poison or something, the next king would be the Count of Angoulême, and that was the man she was supposed to marry as soon as she was old enough, and then she would be queen, and she would have as much to say about things as Madame Anne did now. Margaret hoped that nothing would happen to Charles. She wanted him to live a long time and take good care of the people, as kings and queens were supposed to. Next week, on Whit Thursday, she was going to wash the feet of 13 poor people and give each a golden half-ducat. That was fun, giving golden ducats away to make people happy, especially those who came to perform for her, like the singers and players and dancers, and that wonderful man who could twist himself up all in knots and untie himself again. That was fun to watch, wonderful fun. It tickled her toes just to think of it. Jumping up, she went dancing and twirling about the room until out of breath, and then she plumped herself down beside her dear governess and gave her a hug and a kiss for finishing the lovely doll's dress.